I was a sound technician for the Administratum Census Habitation Bureau, 3rd Terrace, Hive Primus. My job was simple. Calibrate the acoustic monitoring stations that tracked population density through ambient noise levels. The Imperium counts its citizens in many ways: by ration chits, by oxygen consumption, by waste production, and I counted them by the sounds they made. 43 years I did this work, threading through maintenance ducts with my tools and my authorized clearance, adjusting microphones embedded in structural supports, clearing speaker grills of accumulated grime. Honest work, necessary work, the kind that earns you a HAB unit on Terrace 9 and a protein ration that includes real fungus twice a week. The screams started 3 months before I understood what I was hearing. At first, they registered only as anomalies in my daily calibration reports. The acoustic monitoring system was old, installed during the founding of Hive Primus some 8,000 years ago, maintained by 700 generations of technicians like myself. We worked in the spaces between the spaces, the architectural interstices where the hive's skeleton showed through. The equipment was temperamental, prone to picking up interference from the millions of machines grinding away in the factorums, the vox traffic bleeding through improperly shielded cables, the vibrations from the transit systems that shook the superstructure like a vast bell. Strange sounds were normal. Part of the job was filtering signal from noise, identifying the rhythmic thump of 10,000 feet in a worker processional versus the chaotic scatter of a gang fight, distinguishing the industrial hum of a manufactorum from the prayer drone of a shrine. But these screams were different. They came from below. Below is a concept that means something particular when you work in a hive city. Above was where the light came from, filtered and yellowed by the pollution, but still recognizable as connected to the sky. Below was where everything went to be forgotten: waste, criminals, the poor, the mutated, the machinery too old to disassemble but too valuable to abandon. Below was depth measured not in meters but in centuries, each level a sedimentary layer of human habitation pressing down on the previous, compressing history into vertical geography. I worked primarily in the middle reaches, terraces 3 through 15, where the monitoring stations were densest, where the administratum cared most about accurate counts. My clearance allowed me access to maintenance tunnels down to Terrace 23, though I rarely went that deep. The air got too thick, too hot, too full of chemical particulates that made my respirator wheeze. The screams came from below Terrace 23. The first time I noticed them, I was performing a routine calibration in Junction Tertius 7, a maintenance hub where 6 different monitoring feeds converged. The station there was mounted on the exterior of a coolant pipe wide enough to walk through, accessible only via a service ladder that descended through 3 terraces of structural bracing. The sound came through clearly in the isolated quiet of that space, bleeding through the speakers during the diagnostic test, a long, wavering note. Human, unmistakably, too sustained to be a shout of alarm, too raw to be anything but agony. I noted it in my report as probable vox interference from lower HAB emergency services. I'd heard screams before, of course. Hive Primus housed 50 million souls in its upper and middle reaches alone, and human suffering was as common as the air you breathed. Accidents in the factorums, gang violence, disease outbreaks in the undercrowded HAB blocks. The enforcers maintained order with calculated brutality, and sometimes their interrogations were conducted in spaces where the sound carried. But those screams had context. You could hear the words between them, the demands, the pleading. These were just sound, pure, distilled, continuous. I finished the calibration and moved on. Over the following weeks, I heard them again, and again, always in the same locations, the junction stations closest to the major vertical shafts that dropped into the underhive. Always during the diagnostics, when the system was listening most carefully, filtering out the background noise to focus on specific frequencies. The screams were in the low registers, the range where human vocal cords strained, where the sound became something felt in the chest as much as heard. I began to notice patterns, They came in waves, swelling and receding like tides. Sometimes a single voice, sometimes many, overlapping into a chorus that made my skin prickle beneath my work overalls. I mentioned it to Haskell, my supervisor, during our monthly review. He was a thick-necked man with augmetic eyes that never quite focused on anything, forever scanning the data slates that governed our section's efficiency ratings. "Interference?" he said, not looking up. "Submit a request for equipment inspection. Could be feedback from the industrial sectors." "It doesn't sound like feedback," I said. "It sounds like people." "Then it's people," Haskell said, finally meeting my gaze with those dead glass eyes. "Hive, Primus, has 50 million people. You can't calibrate a station without hearing some of them." He marked something on his slate. "Equipment inspection request. File it properly." I filed the request. It was denied. Insufficient priority. Equipment inspections required specialized tech priests from the Mechanicus enclaves, and their time was allocated according to the sacred hierarchies of maintenance schedules that had been optimized over millennia. A few anomalous sounds did not qualify as malfunction. The system was functioning within acceptable parameters. The screams were not in the official frequency ranges monitored for census habitation purposes. Therefore, officially, they did not exist, but I could hear them. I began to hear them in other places, not just at the junction stations, but in the smaller monitoring posts scattered throughout my territory. Station Tertius 12, mounted in the ceiling of an abandoned storage vault. Station Tertius 18, installed in the wall of a transit tunnel used by ore haulers. Station Tertius 21, deep in the bowels of Terrace 11, where the air tasted like iron and the walls wept condensation that stained the rockcrete orange. Everywhere I went, during the diagnostic tests, the screams would surface, sometimes faint, barely distinguishable from static, sometimes crystal clear, as if the person was standing directly beside the microphone, pouring their anguish into the machine. I started listening when I wasn't supposed to. During lunch breaks, I would access the monitoring feeds from my data slate, cycling through the stations, searching for the sounds. I told myself I was being thorough, that I was investigating a technical problem that my supervisor had dismissed. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. I needed to know what I was hearing. The screams had become an itch in my mind, a question without an answer. And questions like that don't let you rest. They grow, they metastasize. After 6 weeks, I broke protocol and descended to Terrace 24. My clearance didn't extend that far, but security in the maintenance tunnels was light. The administratum assumed that anyone with the technical knowledge to navigate the service passages wouldn't abuse their access, an assumption based on the terrifying mundanity of what we did. Who would risk punishment to see more of the hive's intestines? But I had heard something that the administratum couldn't explain, and in the Imperium, unexplained things are dangerous things, dangerous to ignore, dangerous to investigate, dangerous simply to know about. I went anyway. The descent took 3 hours. The service ladder was old, older than the Imperium perhaps, riveted into the side of a transit shaft that no longer carried anything but hot air rising from the depths. My hands ached from gripping the rungs, and my respirator struggled with the increasing humidity. The temperature rose as I descended, a dry heat that made sweat evaporate before it could soak my clothes. The walls were black with industrial residue, and strange fungi grew in patches where moisture collected, pale and fleshy, releasing spores that made my eyes water even behind the protective lenses. Terrace 24 was a ruin. Not abandoned, but forgotten. There's a difference. Abandoned implies conscious decision, formal decommissioning, a line drawn in some ledger declaring the space no longer useful. Forgotten means that the line was never drawn, that the space simply fell out of the administratum's vast cognitive map, slipping into the gaps between bureaucratic territories. Power still flowed here, carried by cables that no one remembered installing. Lighting panels still functioned, triggered by motion sensors whose data fed into monitoring systems that no longer existed. Machinery still ran, performing tasks whose purpose had been lost generations ago. And there were people. I saw them from a distance at first, emerging from my access tunnel into what had once been a residential hab block. The architecture was ancient, pre-imperial perhaps, the walls carved from the living rock of the hive's foundation. The ceilings were low, oppressive, and the doorways were narrow slits that seemed designed to humble anyone passing through them. The people moved through these spaces like ghosts, silent and slow, their faces hidden by ragged hoods or crude masks fashioned from scavenged materials. They didn't seem to notice me, or if they did, they didn't care. I counted 20 in the first chamber alone, squatting beside small fires or huddled in corners, their bodies thin to the point of skeletal. The screams were louder here, not coming from these people, but from somewhere deeper, echoing up through the floor. I could feel them as much as hear them, a vibration that traveled through the rockcrete and into my bones. The people in the chamber didn't react to the sound at all. They'd gone deaf to it, or they'd gone mad, or both. I found a monitoring station in the next chamber, installed in the wall beside a collapsed section of ceiling. The equipment was ancient, the casing pitted with corrosion, but it still functioned. The small green indicator light blinked steadily, confirming that it was transmitting data back to the central processing node in my district. I accessed the diagnostic panel and ran a test. The screams came through immediately, no longer mediated by distance or electronic filtering. They were right there, directly beneath me, separated by perhaps 50 meters of rockcrete and whatever spaces existed in the hive's underbelly. I followed the sound. The passages grew narrower, more treacherous. The lighting failed in sections, forcing me to navigate by the small luminator attached to my tool harness. The walls were covered in graffiti here, not the gang markers common in the middle hive, but something older, stranger. Symbols I didn't recognize, prayers in languages I didn't speak, crude pictograms showing figures with too many limbs, or too few, arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. The air grew worse, thick with a smell like burnt copper and rotten meat, strong enough that I could taste it through my respirator's filters. The screaming grew clearer. Individual voices emerged from the chorus. I could distinguish tone, pitch, the specific textures of different people in pain. A high, keening wail, a low, broken moan, a rhythmic sobbing that never quite resolved into words, and beneath it all, a sound like machinery, like vast gears grinding, like metal scraping against metal in the darkness. I found the shaft by accident, nearly walking into it in the dim light. It was a ventilation duct, perhaps, or a waste disposal chute, some vertical passage that plunged straight down into the foundation of the hive. The screaming came from there, rising on currents of hot air that stank of chemicals and human waste. I approached the edge carefully, shining my luminator into the darkness. The beam didn't reach the bottom. It just kept going, swallowed by depth that might have been 50 meters or 500. But I could see the sides of the shaft, and that was enough. The walls were covered in people, not standing on platforms or clinging to ladders, but embedded in the rockcrete itself, their bodies half swallowed by the stone, as if the wall had been liquid when they were pressed into it and had since hardened. Some were skeletal, ancient, their bones yellowed and brittle. Others were fresher, their flesh still clinging to their frames, their faces twisted in expressions of terminal agony. And some were alive. I could see them breathing, see their chests rising and falling in shallow rhythms, see their eyes moving beneath closed lids. Their mouths were open. They were screaming, not all of them. Some were silent, their voices gone, or their lungs collapsed, or their minds simply broken beyond the capacity to make sound. But enough of them were screaming that the shaft had become a resonance chamber, amplifying their agony into a single continuous note that rose up through the monitoring system, up through the ventilation ducts, up through the very bones of the hive to the stations I calibrated every day. I stood there for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. My mind kept rejecting it, offering explanations that couldn't possibly be true. A punishment detail, a mining accident, a cult sacrifice. But none of those explanations fit the scale of it. There were hundreds of bodies in the shaft, thousands perhaps, layered like sediment, the oldest at the top and the newest at the bottom, a vertical graveyard that descended into the hive's foundation. And then I saw the machinery. It was subtle, easy to miss in the darkness. Cables running through the rockcrete, connecting the bodies in some kind of vast network. Tubes penetrating their flesh, feeding them, or draining them, or both. Small devices attached to their skulls, blinking with tiny indicator lights, recording or transmitting or processing. The people weren't just embedded in the wall, they were connected to something, made part of some system whose purpose I couldn't begin to guess. I ran. The rational part of my mind, the part that had kept me safe through 43 years of careful, cautious service to the administratum, screamed at me to document what I'd found, to record evidence, to follow proper reporting protocols. But the animal part, the part that understood danger on a level deeper than thought, drove me back through the tunnels, back up the service ladder, back to the familiar territory of Terrace 9, where my hab unit waited and my ration chit was valid, and the world made the kind of sense that allowed you to sleep at night. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I lay in my bunk, listening to the sounds of the hive around me, the constant grind of machinery, the muffled voices of my neighbors through the thin walls, the hum of the air recyclers, and beneath it all, faint but present, I could hear the screaming. It was always there. It had always been there. I'd just never isolated it before, never stripped away the layers of noise to expose the foundation beneath. I filed a report. Not to Haskell, I knew what his response would be, but directly to the Administratum's incident registry, a bureaucratic dead end where functionaries logged anomalies that were too minor to warrant investigation, but too official to ignore entirely. I described what I'd found in careful, technical language, framing it as a potential hazard to the monitoring equipment rather than a humanitarian crisis. Equipment damage due to environmental contamination, possible unauthorized modifications to census habitation infrastructure, recommended inspection by authorized personnel. The report was acknowledged. A reference number was assigned. No further action was taken. I tried to continue my work. I calibrated stations, filed reports, attended maintenance briefings. But the screams had changed for me. They were no longer abstract sounds, no longer technical problems to be filtered and ignored. Every time I ran a diagnostic test, every time the speakers crackled to life with that low, sustained agony, I saw the shaft. I saw the bodies embedded in the walls. I saw the machinery connecting them, using them, keeping them alive for purposes I couldn't fathom. I began investigating, carefully. During my authorized duties, I started accessing older maintenance records, tracing the history of the monitoring system back through the centuries. The equipment I calibrated was ancient, yes, but it had been modified repeatedly over the millennia, upgraded and expanded and repurposed by generations of tech priests and technicians. The deeper I dug, the more I found references to acoustic processing substations and biological resonance matrices, and other terminology that didn't appear in any of my training materials. The monitoring system wasn't just recording sound, it was doing something with it. I found a name, eventually. Buried in a maintenance log from 600 years ago, a single line referencing Project Canacle, and a designation for subsystems installed in the lower hive. I searched for more information, but that name appeared nowhere else in the accessible records. Either it had been purged, or it had never been properly documented, or it existed in archives far above my clearance level. I became obsessed. I stopped filing reports. I stopped attending briefings. I spent my days in the Administratum's record vaults, requesting ancient data slates and architectural schematics, piecing together fragments of information that hinted at something vast and terrible beneath the everyday horror of hive life. The monitoring system extended far deeper than I'd known, down through the lower hive into the underhive, into the sump itself, into depths where the rockcrete gave way to raw planetary rock, and the temperature climbed to the point where unprotected flesh would blister. And everywhere the system went, there were bodies, thousands of them, tens of thousands, perhaps more. I found oblique references in punishment ledgers, lists of criminals and heretics and dissidents who'd been sentenced to terminal census integration rather than execution. I found requisition orders for nutrient paste and medical supplies, quantities that suggested the sustained maintenance of large populations in spaces officially listed as uninhabited. I found budget allocations for acoustic optimization that dwarfed the entire operational cost of the district I worked in. The screaming wasn't a side effect. It was the purpose. I don't know when they noticed me. Perhaps it was when I started accessing restricted records. Perhaps it was when I missed too many shifts, when my efficiency ratings dropped below acceptable parameters. Perhaps they'd been watching me since I filed that first report, waiting to see if I'd let it go, or if I'd become a problem that needed solving. The Administratum has infinite patience for most forms of incompetence, but curiosity is a different matter. Curiosity implies the desire to know things that you haven't been told, and in the Imperium, that desire is the first step toward heresy. The Arbites came for me 3 months after I descended to Terrace 24. Not the regular enforcers who maintained order on my terrace, but proper Arbites in carapace armor, with suppression shields and shock mauls, the kind who enforced the Emperor's law rather than the local gang truces. They arrived at my hab unit at the start of the night cycle, when the corridors were empty and the witnesses were few. They didn't explain. They didn't need to. I knew. The interrogation was efficient. They didn't waste time with violence. I wasn't important enough for that. They simply asked questions and cross-referenced my answers against the records they'd pulled from my data slate and work terminal. Yes, I'd exceeded my clearance. Yes, I'd accessed restricted information. Yes, I'd filed a complaint about anomalous sounds that weren't technically malfunctions. Yes, I'd failed to report for duty. Yes, 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 to everything. What was there to deny? The magistrate who reviewed my case was young, younger than me by decades, his face smooth and his eyes bright with the kind of certainty that comes from never having doubted the Imperium's perfection. He read the charges in a bored, monotone dereliction of duty, unauthorized access, potential information security breach, and then he paused, looking up at me with something almost like curiosity. "Do you know what you found?" he asked. I said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. "You found one of the Imperium's miracles," he said. "Necromunda supplies 300 billion tons of raw material to the forges of the sector every year. To accomplish this, the hives must function at maximum efficiency, every citizen performing their assigned role without deviation or distraction. But citizens are weak. They grow tired. They grow angry. They grow doubtful. These emotions are poison to productivity." He stood, walking around his desk, to face me directly. So the Mechanicus, in their wisdom, devised a solution. The negative emotions must be extracted, channeled, processed. The monitoring system doesn't just record sound, it absorbs it. The substations you calibrate are intake nodes, drawing in the ambient suffering of the population and transmitting it downward, where it's concentrated in human vessels, specially prepared to contain it. Those vessels scream. Yes, they scream continuously. But their screaming keeps the upper hives calm. It keeps the workers productive. It keeps the Imperium strong. I felt something break inside me, some last fragment of hope that this had all been a mistake, an accident, something that could be fixed. "How many?" I managed. "Millions," the magistrate said. "Across all the hives of Necromunda. The system has been operating for 8,000 years. It's one of the reasons Necromunda is so valuable to the Imperium. Our citizens are unusually compliant, unusually willing to endure hardship. They don't know why. They don't need to know why. The suffering is drawn from them before it can fester into rebellion, absorbed by the condemned in the depths, who have already been judged unfit for service." "That's insane," I said. The magistrate smiled, a thin expression that never reached his eyes. "That's the Imperium," he said. "You're a sound technician. You should appreciate the efficiency. One scream can muffle 1,000 complaints. One life in agony can sustain 10,000 in productive misery. The mathematics are quite elegant. And now? I asked. Now you understand too much, he said. But you're not important enough to execute, and execution would be wasteful. You're healthy. You're sane. You still have decades of useful service ahead of you. He gestured to the Arbites waiting by the door. Terminal census integration, he said. Substation Tertius 7. I believe you know where that is. They took me down. Back down through the terraces I'd worked in for 43 years, down past Terrace 23, down into the ruins of 24, down into passages I'd never seen, down to where the air became liquid heat and the darkness was absolute, except for the small lights on their armor, down to where the screaming was so loud it became texture, a physical pressure against my skull. They brought me to a chamber where the rockcrete walls were still soft, still yielding, maintained at precisely the right consistency by tech priests, whose augmetic enhancements allowed them to work in conditions that would kill unmodified humans in minutes. They pressed me into the wall, and I felt it swallow me, felt it flow around my body like wet cement, supporting my weight as my legs disappeared into the stone. They worked quickly, efficiently, attaching the cables and tubes and monitoring devices before the rockcrete hardened, before I could thrash myself free. The connections were precise. The feeding tube slid down my throat, past my gag reflex, directly into my stomach. The waste catheter penetrated with clinical indifference. The neural interface attached to my skull with a click I felt more than heard. Tiny needles penetrating bone to reach the surface of my brain. And then the drugs began flowing. Chemicals designed to keep me awake, keep me aware, keep me feeling everything while preventing my body from shutting down or my mind from retreating into merciful catatonia. The pain came gradually, not from the embedding that was complete but from what came next. The monitoring system activated, and I felt it then, the presence of something vast and inhuman touching my consciousness. Not the machine god, nothing so holy, but the machine itself, the ancient intelligence woven through 8,000 years of technology and human suffering. It began to feed. The emotions came first. Fear, anger, despair, grief, every negative feeling that the citizens of the upper hives produced in their daily grinding existence filtered down through the monitoring stations I'd spent my life calibrating. Concentrated in the human batteries like me, embedded in the hive's foundation. I felt them all at once. Millions of small miseries combining into a single overwhelming tide. My mind tried to process them, to categorize them, to find meaning in the chaos. But there were too many, too fast, an endless stream of human suffering flowing into me like water into a drain. And I screamed, "Emperor!" I screamed. I screamed until my throat tore, until blood filled my mouth around the feeding tube, until the only sound I could make was a broken wheeze that the monitoring system captured and processed and analyzed for efficiency. And when my voice finally gave out, when the physical capacity to scream had been exhausted, I kept screaming internally, silently, an endless mental wail that the neural interface translated into data that was no different from the audible kind. The tech priests monitored me during those first hours, adjusting the chemical balance, fine-tuning the neural interface, ensuring that I was processing the emotional input at optimal efficiency. One of them spoke to me, though whether to explain or to justify, I couldn't tell. "You are serving the Imperium," he said, his voice rendered mechanical by his vox augmetic. "Every scream you produce allows 1,000 workers to labor in peace. Every hour you endure keeps the hive productive. You are more valuable now than you ever were calibrating stations." I tried to respond, tried to tell him that this was wrong, that no amount of productivity could justify this, but my voice was gone, and the neural interface wasn't configured for communication in reverse. I could only receive, only absorb, only process the endless stream of suffering that the monitoring system fed into me. Time became meaningless. The drugs kept me awake, kept me locked in an eternal present where past and future collapsed into an endless now of pain and awareness. I lost track of how long I'd been embedded. Days? Weeks? The feeding tube kept my body alive, and the waste catheter removed what my body didn't need, and the chemical pumps adjusted their cocktails to keep me at the precise edge of consciousness where the screaming was most efficient. But my mind adapted. Slowly, terribly, I began to find patterns in the chaos. The suffering that flowed into me wasn't random, it had rhythms, cycles, variations that corresponded to the daily life of the hive above. Morning brought anxiety, the dread of another work shift beginning. Midday brought frustration, the accumulation of small failures and indignities. Evening brought exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of bodies pushed beyond their limits. Night brought fear, the terror of the darkness and what it might contain. I learned to anticipate these cycles. I learned to prepare myself for the surges, to brace my consciousness against the flood before it arrived, and in doing so, I began to hear the individual voices within the chorus. Not literally, the monitoring system didn't transmit coherent thoughts, but I could sense the texture of different people's suffering, distinguish the quiet despair of a manufactorum worker from the sharp panic of someone facing arbitrator judgment, separate the dull ache of chronic hunger from the acute agony of industrial accident. I began to understand what the magistrate had meant when he called it a miracle. The system worked. The upper hives were calm, productive, efficient, because their citizens' capacity for discontent had been excised and channeled downward, absorbed by the condemned who would scream for them. The Imperium had found a way to industrialize suffering itself, to process human misery the way it processed ore and biomass and everything else it needed to sustain its vast machinery. And I was part of it now. Not a technician maintaining the system, but a component of it, a biological circuit in a machine that stretched across the entire hive, across all the hives of Necromunda, possibly across the entire Imperium for all I knew. How many others were there like me, embedded in the foundations of hive cities across 10,000 worlds, screaming silently in the dark so that the Emperor's subjects could labor in relative peace? The other voices found me eventually. The bodies embedded near me in the shaft, those who'd been there long enough to adapt as I had, to retain some fragment of identity within the dissolution. We couldn't communicate, the neural interfaces weren't designed for that, but we could sense each other, recognize the patterns of individual consciousness within the greater flow. Some had been there for decades, some for centuries, their bodies sustained far beyond natural limits by the Mechanicus technology that viewed human suffering as just another resource to be optimized. One presence was stronger than the others, older, deeper. It had been here since the beginning, or close to it, one of the first to be integrated into the system when it was still experimental, when the tech priests were still refining the process. It had long since stopped being human in any meaningful sense. It had become something else, something vast and distributed. Its consciousness spread across the entire monitoring network like a ghost in the machine. It touched my mind, and I understood. The system wasn't Mechanicus. It predated the Imperium. The ancient equipment I'd spent my life calibrating, the monitoring stations installed in the hive's foundation during its first construction, they were older than the Emperor's conquest of Terra, older than the Age of Strife. Remnants of some Dark Age technology that humanity had built when it still dared to reshape reality according to its own desires, rather than the Emperor's will. The settlers of Necromunda had found it already installed in the depths of their new world, a vast machine whose purpose they'd only dimly understood, but whose utility they'd recognized immediately. The screaming wasn't about emotion processing or productivity optimization. Those were justifications invented later, excuses that allowed the administratum to continue using something they couldn't fully comprehend. The truth was simpler and worse. The machine fed on suffering, not metaphorically, but literally. Human agony was its fuel, its sustenance, its purpose. And it was still growing, still expanding, still hungry for more. The Imperium hadn't built a tool to improve efficiency. The Imperium had chained itself to an ancient predator and convinced itself that the feeding was necessary, that the sacrifices were justified, that the screaming in the depths was the price of order and prosperity and continued survival. And perhaps it was. Perhaps the machine was too deeply integrated now to be removed, too fundamental to the hive's operation to be shut down without catastrophic collapse. Perhaps millions screaming in the dark was a better outcome than billions dying in the light. Or perhaps that was just what we told ourselves to make it bearable. I don't know how long I've been here now. Time has lost all meaning, collapsed into an eternal present of suffering that the neural interface captures and processes and feeds back into the system. My body is gone, or mostly gone. The rockcrete has claimed everything below my chest, and the rest is sustained only by the tubes and cables and chemical pumps. My mind is fragmenting, pieces of my identity dissolving into the greater network, joining the chorus of the damned who scream beneath the hives. But some part of me remains. Some fragment of the technician I was, the man who calibrated stations and filed reports and believed that the Imperium was something other than an efficient mechanism for converting human beings into screams. That fragment holds on to certain truths, certain observations that might matter to someone, somewhere, if they ever have the misfortune to discover what I discovered. The monitoring stations I maintained are everywhere. Every hive city has them. Every world where humans cluster in sufficient density to require management has some version of the system. The specifics vary. Some places use different technologies, different methods of extraction and processing, but the fundamental architecture is the same. The Imperium runs on suffering, not as a side effect, not as an unfortunate necessity, but as a deliberate design feature. The entire vast machinery of human civilization has been optimized to generate misery in concentrations sufficient to feed the hungry machines that keep it running, and we accept it. Those of us who know, who've seen the mechanism clearly, we accept it because the alternative is worse. Rebellion means death. Questioning means integration. The only safe response is compliance, is continuing to perform your assigned function within the system until the system decides you're more valuable as fuel than as labor. I was a sound technician for 43 years. I counted citizens by the noises they made. I thought I was serving the Imperium, serving the Emperor, serving humanity's continued survival among the stars. Perhaps I was. Perhaps this is what service means in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. Perhaps there's no difference between maintaining the system and being consumed by it. No meaningful distinction between technician and victim. The screaming continues. It will always continue. New bodies arrive regularly, pressed into the softened rockcrete, connected to the network, their voices added to the chorus. The old ones fall silent. Eventually the technology can only sustain them for so long, and when they do, they're absorbed completely, composted into the hive's foundation, their atoms recycled into the very structure they'd spent their final years screaming inside. I'll join them soon. I can feel my consciousness fraying at the edges, pieces of me breaking off and drifting into the network, becoming part of the vast distributed intelligence that haunts the monitoring system. Soon there won't be enough left to remember that I was once a person named. The name's already gone. But the screaming remains. The screaming is eternal. The screaming is the foundation upon which the Imperium rests. The sound beneath all sounds, the voice of 10,000 years of human civilization crying out in the darkness. If you listen carefully, in any hive city, in any crowded hab block, in any manufactorum or shrine or administrative office, if you strip away the machine noise and the prayer drones and the vox chatter and the endless grinding industry, you'll hear it. Faint, constant, inescapable, the screams beneath the hives. And now, you'll never unhear them.